I'm Ellen Lageman, Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome my friend Luke Menand to the Asquith Forum, even though we're not in the Asquith Forum. Luke primarily serves as professor of English and American Literature and Language in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, but he has also joined the Ed School faculty, which we find to be a delight. Even though he is brilliantly versed in the 19th century, Luke keeps his finger equally on the pulse of the 21st century, as evidenced by his regular columns in the New Yorker and his frequent columns in the New York Review of Books. Luke is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Metaphysical Club, which was published in 2001. And he is here today to discuss pragmatism's 3 moments. As some of you may know, pragmatism is a distinctly American philosophy that is based on experience and experiment rather than on fixed principles. As Luke demonstrates, pragmatism transformed American intellectual thought in the late 19th century and gained popularity into the early 20th century through the works of John Dewey. In a recent interview that you can read at length on the Hugsy website, Luke pointed out that Dewey's ideas about early childhood education came out of pragmatism, and that more recently, pragmatism has come to play a central role in reimagining liberal education. Luke and I actually met at a conference in Florida at Rollins College on liberal education. It was a great conference, but they put us in a motel with the biggest cockroaches I have ever seen in my life. And I suspect it was the physical challenges of the living arrangements, as well as the really interesting conversations, that made that conference memorable. There is a book that came out of the conference called Education and Democracy, Reimagining Liberal Learning in America. And the first essay is by Luke, and the second one is by me. So we would love to sell copies of our book. But Luke is here to talk about his newer book, and I am delighted that he has decided to come join us in Cambridge, and I expect we will continue to have many conversations with him. Luke.
Thank you. Pragmatism is the only philosophical system I know that can survive its own refutation. Pragmatism has an explanation for everything, even for why some people think that pragmatism is worthless as an explanation for anything. The reason is simple. Pragmatism is an idea about ideas. The idea is that ideas, theories, beliefs, convictions, principles, concepts, hypotheses are essentially means of adaptation. We have ideas because they help us cope with our environment. They help us to get what we want from the world. When the world changes, we may wish to change our ideas. In fact, when the world changes, we often need to change our ideas. This idea about ideas is itself an idea. Like any other idea, pragmatism is an idea whose usefulness to us may change from one historical moment to another. Today, we may be pragmatists. Tomorrow, we might be absolutists, essentialists, foundationalists, fundamentalists. When this happens, when the idea of pragmatism no longer seems valid or appealing, the response of the pragmatist is, I can explain. Because on a pragmatic theory of ideas, there will always be times when the pragmatic theory of ideas doesn't work for us. There will be times when pragmatism is, pragmatically speaking, no longer true. I'm going to talk about pragmatism in the context of 3 moments in American history when it seemed, pragmatically speaking, true or valid or useful to a significant number of people, or more accurately, to a significant number of intellectuals. Pragmatism is often referred to as the American philosophy, sometimes with the implication that it is somehow a philosophical expression of something that the typical American actually believes and practices, even though without knowing it, like Monsieur Jourdain, that he is pragmatizing. I do think that pragmatism arose in the context of a particular American experience. But the original pragmatists, the 19th century pragmatists, thought of themselves as members of a transatlantic intellectual community. They did not go around asserting patriotic or nationalist claims for their ideas. I also think that if you explain pragmatism to most Americans, and certainly to most elected officials, they would be proud to pronounce anathema upon it. American culture is an individualist, first-principled, God-thanking culture, and pragmatism is none of those things. But pragmatism has had an enormous appeal to American intellectuals at certain points in American history. And I think that understanding why pragmatism emerged and exercised its appeal at those moments is the best way of understanding what pragmatism is all about. And it's also, of course, the most pragmatic way of understanding it. These are the three moments I have in mind. The first is the years immediately following the American Civil War, when a pragmatic theory of belief arose among a group of young intellectuals in Cambridge, a group that included William James, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Charles Peirce. A second moment happened 30 years after that, between 1898 and 1917, which is the period when pragmatism emerged as a full-fledged philosophical movement whose champions were James and John Dewey. The third moment is very recent, in the 1990s, when neo-pragmatism flourished in a variety of areas of thought and practice, from architecture to the law. The pragmatists in this period are people like the philosopher Richard Rorty, the legal theorist Richard Posner, and the literary critic Stanley Fish. And the question I'm going to close with is whether or not we should say that this third pragmatic moment has, since September 11th, come to an end. A philosophical concept that has been associated with John Dewey, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Cornel West, and Stanley Fish is a pretty flexible philosophical concept. And the first thing we need to do is to try to come up with a general definition that will explain why each of these figures, along with lots of other people, such as Alan Locke, Hilary Putnam, George Herbert Mead, Walter Ben Michaels, Peter Eisenman, and Richard Rorty, can plausibly be called all pragmatists. And here's a possible one-size-fits-all definition. Pragmatism is basically an account of the way people think, the way they come up with ideas, form beliefs, reach decisions. Like any broadly diffused philosophical idea like existentialism or postmodernism or even Marxism, pragmatism develops a lot of ideological and idiosyncratic accretions. It's a dummy that has been dressed in an infinite variety of clothes. It's a sort of philosophy that lends itself to course titles or book titles like beginning Pragmatism and blank. Now, but if you take off all the clothes and get down to the dummy, this is what I think the dummy is all about. It's all about how human beings think to make decisions. What makes us decide to do one thing when we might do another thing instead? The question seems unanswerable because life presents us with many kinds of choices, and no single explanation can be expected to cover every case. Deciding whether to order the lobster or the steak is not the same sort of thing as deciding whether the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In the first case, assuming the lobster is not overpriced, which it usually is, we consult our taste, and in the second, we consult our judgment, try to keep our taste out of it. But knowing more or less what category a particular decision belongs to, knowing whether the decision is a matter of personal preference or impersonal judgment, doesn't make that decision any easier to make. Order what you feel like eating, your impatient dinner companion says. But the problem is you don't know what you feel like eating. What you feel like eating is precisely what you are trying to figure out. Order what you feel like eating is just a piece of advice about the criteria you should be using to guide your deliberations in a restaurant. It's not a solution to your menu problem, just as do the right thing or tell the truth are only suggestions about criteria. They're not answers to actual dilemmas. The actual dilemma is what in the particular case staring you in the face the right thing to do or the honest thing to say really is. And making those kinds of decisions about what is right or what is truthful is like deciding what to order in a restaurant, in the sense that getting a handle on tastiness is no harder or easier, even though it may be less important, than getting a handle on justice or truth. People reach decisions most of the time by thinking. Some of the time they flip a coin, but usually they think. This is a pretty banal statement, but the process it names is inscrutable. An acquaintance gives you a piece of advice. An acquaintance gives you a piece of advice, a piece of information, in strict confidence. Later on, a close friend of yours, lacking that information that this acquaintance gave you, is about to make a bad mistake. Should you betray the confidence? Do the right thing, but what is the right thing? Keeping your word, or helping someone you care about avoid injury or embarrassment? Even in this little hypothetical case, the choice between principles is complicated, as it always is in life, by circumstances. If the close friend was the person who gave you the information in strict confidence, and the acquaintance was about to make the mistake, you would almost certainly think about your choice differently, as you would if you thought that the acquaintance was a nasty person, or that the friend was a lucky person, or that the statute of limitations on the secret had probably run out, or that you had acquired a terrible habit of betraying confidences and you really ought to stop it. In the end, you will do what you believe is right, but rightness will be, in effect, the complement you give to the outcome of your deliberations. Though it is always in view while you are thinking, what is right is something that appears in its complete form at the end, not the beginning of your thinking. When we think, in other words, we do not simply consult principles or reasons or sentiments or even tastes, because before thinking, all these things are indeterminate. Thinking is what makes them concrete. Deciding to order the lobster helps us determine that we have a taste for lobster. Deciding that the defendant is guilty helps us establish the standard of justice that applies in this case. Choosing to keep a confidence helps make honesty a principle. Choosing to betray it helps to confirm the value we put on friendship. Does this mean that our choices are arbitrary or self-serving? That standards and principles are just whatever it is in our interest at the moment to say they are? That they're pretexts for satisfying selfish ends or gratifying personal impulses? This is the question the pragmatist account immediately and invariably raises. The question of whether pragmatism is a debunking of values like truth and objectivity, and a license for relativism and creeping nihilism, which is at least to be preferred to galloping nihilism. There's no real way to answer this question except to say that it rarely feels as though this is the case. We usually don't end up deciding what to do because it seems pleasant or convenient at the moment. Experience teaches us that this is rarely a wise basis for making a choice. When we're happy with a decision, it's because it doesn't feel arbitrary. It feels like the decision we had to reach. Nobody says, I know it's perfectly arbitrary, but it feels right. This is because its inevitability is a function of its fit with the whole set of assumptions of our self-understanding and of the social world we inhabit. The assumptions that give the moral weight, much greater moral weight than just logic could ever give to every judgment that we make. And this is why so often we know we're right before we know why we're right. First we decide, then we deduce. So it does not follow, to a pragmatist, that it's meaningless to talk of beliefs being true or untrue. It only means that there is no non-circular set of criteria for knowing whether a particular belief is true. There's no appeal to some standard outside the process of coming to the belief itself. For thinking just is a circular process in which some end, some imagined outcome, is already present at the beginning of any train of thought. William James said in a series of lectures on pragmatism he gave in 1907, truth happens to an idea. It becomes true, is made true by events. Its verity is, in fact, an event a process, the process, namely, of its verifying itself. And elsewhere in the same lectures, he says, quote, "The true is only the expedient in the way of our thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving," end quote. Thinking is a free-form and boundless activity that nevertheless leads to outcomes we feel justified in calling true, or just, or moral. The concept of pragmatism seems to have first emerged in 1872, during or in some way around the edges of the meetings of a group that's known to history as the Metaphysical Club. The club existed only for 9 or 10 months. No records apparently were kept, and it's not even completely certain who attended the meetings. But 3 people we're fairly confident were members were the future psychologist William James, his best friend in those days, the future Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and the scientist and philosopher Charles Peirce. All these men were in their late 20s at the time. The person who's supposed to have coined and defined the term pragmatism was Charles Peirce, though by the time the club met in 1872, Holmes and James already had arrived at their own versions of the same basic pragmatic idea. The members of the Metaphysical Club all belonged to the generation that lived through the Civil War. 2 of them, Holmes and a lawyer named Nicholas St. John Green, had fought in the war. William James had not, but 2 of his younger brothers had, and the war had done lasting damage to their lives. The man who was the ringleader of the club, a philosopher named Chauncey Wright, who was an influence on the pragmatists, though he was not really a pragmatist himself, had a brother who died at Cold Harbor. And of course, the war and the issues over which it was fought had dominated intellectual life in Cambridge and Boston the whole time these people were growing up. Not just intellectual life, of course, there were riots in the streets. It's hard not to conclude that the experience of the war was one of the background events for the emergence of a pragmatic way of thinking. I've already suggested what that way of thinking was, that what the pragmatists had in common was not a group of ideas, but a single idea, an idea about ideas. They believe that ideas are not out there waiting to be discovered. They're just tools that people devise to cope with the world in which they find themselves. They also believe that ideas are not produced by individuals, but by groups of individuals, that ideas are social. They believe that ideas do not develop according to some inner logic of their own, but are entirely dependent, like germs, on their human carriers and the environment. And they believe that since ideas are provisional responses to particular and irreproducible circumstances, their survival depends not on their immutability, but on their adaptability, which is why pragmatism, like any other philosophy, has its moments. They saw beliefs as teleological, that is, beliefs are designed for ends that the organism wishes to attain. They understood beliefs to be instruments of adaptation. Now, the obvious inspiration for this way of thinking about beliefs and ideas was Darwin. And in the minds of James and Peirce and Chauncey Wright, Darwin was almost certainly more relevant to their discussions than the Civil War. On the Origin of Species was published in 1859, a little more than a year before the fall of Fort Sumter. On the Origin of Species is not an argument for evolution. The word evolution appears only a few times in the course of the book. It's an argument about how evolution happens, that is, by the natural selection of chance variations. By 1872, when the Metaphysical Club got together, the theory of natural selection had largely won the day among scientists in places like Cambridge. And if you apply the theory of natural selection to ideas, you get pragmatism. The pragmatists began by asking the question, why do we have minds? Now, on a traditional philosophical view, also a traditional theological view, minds are entities distinct from bodies. We have brains, which are physical organs like lungs and livers and so forth, and then there are minds, which can be considered in non-physical terms. Brains are the subject matter of biology, and minds are the subject matter of metaphysics. But on a Darwinian view, there is no distinction like that, because minds are as much an outcome of natural selection as lungs and livers and opposable thumbs. The fact that you can't put your finger on consciousness, that you can't really measure it, doesn't mean that it arose out of non-evolutionary forces. If we take a Darwinian approach, we have to assume that organisms with minds were naturally selected over organisms without minds, or with minds that are different from our own, and we have to account for that selection in terms of the ultimate ends of evolutionary development, which are adaptation, reproduction, and survival. The pragmatists thought that traditional philosophy operated on the premise that the reason we have minds is to make accurate representations of the way things really are. That when we form beliefs about the world, our goal is to mirror reality. And so the test of the truthfulness of those beliefs is the accuracy with which we have mirrored the external world. So then philosophy traditionally becomes a business of answering the question, how can we know the world as it really is? Now, the pragmatist answer to this question is to point out that nobody has ever made a problem about the relation between the hand and the world. Function of the hand is to help the organism cope with the environment. Situations in which a hand doesn't work, we try something else, like a foot, or a fishhook, or an editorial. Nobody worries in these situations about the lack of some fit about whether the physical world was or was not made to be manipulated by hands. They just use a hand where a hand will do. The pragmatists thought that minds are the same as hands. They're instruments for coping. An idea for them has no greater metaphysical stature than, say, a fork. When your fork proves inadequate to the task of eating soup, it makes little sense to argue about whether there's something inherent in the nature of forks or something inherent in the nature of soup that accounts for the failure. You just reach for a spoon. Therefore, it makes as little sense to talk about a split that needs to be overcome between the mind and the world as it does to talk about a split between the hand and the environment, or the fork and the soup. As James put it, truth is the name for whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief. What makes an idea true is not its correspondence to a mind-independent reality, not the fact that it mirrors accurately the way things really are. There is no evolutionary logic for having a mirror in our heads. What makes a belief true is that it puts us into a better relation with the world. It pays for us to hold it. It helps us to survive and reproduce. There's no sense in talking about an objective or impersonal truth, because all our thinking is shaped by our interests, our fears, and our hopes. Knowledge is always partial and provisional because it was for partial and provisional reasons that we sought it. Pragmatism was a scandal to philosophy for the same reason Darwinism was a scandal to theology. Darwinism is a pure materialism. It describes a universe which unfolds according to processes that are natural, chance-generated, and blind. No intelligence determines the course evolution takes. It's all a matter of chance. Pragmatism similarly accounted for truth without recourse to a transcendent realm, or to absolute moral values, or to the way things really are in themselves. Pragmatism doesn't solve the problem of objectivity any more than Darwinism solves the problem of the ultimate meaning of life. It just ignores it. Why did a Darwinian way of thinking seem attractive in 1872? Well, one answer, as I've suggested, is that the Civil War was a huge shock to established systems of belief, as traumatic wars do, as the First World War would do for many Europeans 60 years later, and as the Vietnam War would do for many Americans 100 years later. The Civil War discredited the beliefs and assumptions of the generation that came before it. For those beliefs had not prevented the country from going to war, they had not prepared it for the astonishing violence the war unleashed, and most of them seemed absurdly obsolete in the new post-war world. One way to describe the post-war reaction against antebellum intellectual culture, the reaction of which the early pragmatism of Peirce, James, and Holmes was a part, is to say that it was a reaction against certitude, against fixed categories, against the presumption of philosophical or theological infallibility. What was wrong with a generation that had gotten the country into war? It was too sure of itself, too confident in the transcendent importance of its own principles. Pragmatism is fallibilist, skeptical, anti-foundational. It proposes that whatever beliefs may meet our needs today, there's always another set possible and always another way of considering the case. The universe the pragmatist described is unfinished, unpredictable, shot through with contingency. But the violence of the war doesn't go all the way to accounting for the emergence of pragmatism, because pragmatism as a philosophical movement didn't start with the Metaphysical Club. It actually started 26 years later, in 1898, which is the beginning of pragmatism's second moment, and it's also the year in which William James introduced the term pragmatism to the world in a lecture he gave at the University of California at Berkeley. It was only the concept of pragmatism that seems to have been introduced in those Metaphysical Club discussions in 1872, but nobody had taken the trouble to develop it as a philosophy, or even had used the term in print until James did in 1898. Now, soon after he gave that lecture at Berkeley, James hooked up with John Dewey, who was then teaching at the University of Chicago and then later moved to Columbia, and that's when pragmatism became a school of thought. Until James died in 1910, James and Dewey were the tag team of American philosophy. They published books and articles promoting pragmatism and defending it against its many critics. Dewey continued this work until 1917, and then his career goes into other areas. But that period between 1898 and 1917 is the period when American pragmatism was the hottest topic in the international philosophical scene. Still, I think the war does help to explain even the emergence of pragmatism 30 years later. And this is because the Civil War unleashed forces of expansion and industrialization that the arguments over the spread of slavery had kept in check, pent up for more than 30 years. During the 4 years of the war, the North ran the government, and then the presidency was held after the war for the rest of the century by a succession of former Union generals. They built railroads, factories, created mass markets, international trade, research universities. They pushed the country into modernity. What makes a way of life modern? It's not just a change in living conditions, it's a transformation of the way in which life is imagined. Modernity emerges when life is no longer conceived of as cyclical. In pre-modern societies, the purpose of existence is understood to be the reproduction of the customs and practices of the group. Meaning is immanent in all the ordinary processes of life. People do things in their generation so that the same things will continue to be done in the next generation. The ends of life are given at the beginning of life. The idea is to make the world go not forward, but only around. In modern societies, the reproduction of custom is no longer understood as a purpose of existence. And the ends of life are not thought to be given, they are thought to be created or discovered. The individual's life course is not fully dictated at birth, and the society's future is not entirely determined by its past. Meaning is no longer immanent in the processes of ordinary life, since those processes are understood by everyone to be contingent, temporary, time-bound. Meaning is immanent only in history itself, which is now conceived not as a wheel that turns, but as a wheel that moves forward, onward. Modern communities do not simply repeat themselves, they change in unforeseeable directions. The individual's contribution to this movement of the wheel is unspecifiable. Individuals, like societies, are expected to create their own futures. But the correspondence between those individual life courses and the movement of the whole is unmeasurable, a mystery. At the close of life, people cannot look back and know that they have accomplished the task set for them at birth, because this knowledge always lies up ahead, somewhere over history's horizon. Modern societies don't know what will count as valuable in the conduct of life in the long run, because they have no way of predicting what conduct the long run will find itself in a position to respect. This is why there is no greater gesture of honor in modern societies than to be declared, after one's death, to have been ahead of one's time. This declaration gives satisfaction to the living who make it, though it can give none to the dead. People sometimes say that the problem with modernity on this description is that life becomes meaningless, but this has the matter inside out. The problem isn't that life becomes meaningless, the problem is that life becomes the only thing that has meaning. What becomes meaningless in modern societies is death. At no point can one say that the purpose in being alive has been accomplished, since this would be to foreclose the possibility of some future act of self-creation, some future contribution to the movement of the wheel. The only certain knowledge death comes with is the knowledge that the values of one's own time, the values one has tried to live by, are obsolete. Every nation in North Atlantic culture arrived at modernity through its own sequence of historical events. And every nation in North Atlantic culture came to intellectual terms with it sometime in the late 19th century. Pragmatism is the name for the American coming to terms. You can find parallels in the cultures of Germany, France, Great Britain, and Russia. This is why it's possible to think of pragmatism simultaneously as a uniquely American contribution and as also part of a transatlantic Western historical moment. Pragmatism is the modernist philosophy par excellence. It says that life is what matters, but that life, in the end, is held up by nothing. There is nothing out there, outside our practices, to measure the value of those practices. As James said, and this is my favorite two sentences of James's, all homes are in finite experience. Finite experience as such is homeless. Nothing outside of the flux determines the issue of it. Pragmatism became an official philosophical movement at almost exactly the moment between 1898 and 1917 when American social and economic life was tipping over into modern forms of organization, forms whose characteristics reflect the effects of size, impersonal authority, bureaucratic procedure, mass markets. It was the end of the Gilded Age and the beginning of the era of corporate capitalism and of progressivism. The laissez-faire faith that things would work out for the best if left to themselves was dead by 1900, replaced by a faith in management, public oversight, social and economic reform, all in the interests of growth. And the essence of all these faiths is indifference to tradition. Pragmatism, therefore, was part of the spirit of this age. Everything James and Dewey wrote boils down to a single claim. People are the agents of their own destinies. They dispelled the fatalism that haunts almost every 19th century system of thought. James and Dewey described a universe still in progress, a place where no conclusion is foregone and every problem is amenable to the exercise of what Dewey called intelligent action. They spoke in those first 2 decades of the 20th century to a generation of academics, journalists, jurists, policymakers, eager to find scientific solutions to social problems and happy to be given good reasons for ignoring the claims of finished cosmologies. The progressive era was a time of adjustment to life under conditions of modernity, and pragmatism is a philosophy of adjustment. Pragmatism helped give people the assurance that in the way the universe turns out, we get a vote. Now, before I talk about the third pragmatist moment in American history, I want to say something about the major non-pragmatist moment, which was the Cold War. Because after 1945, Holmes, James, and Dewey were figures who really dominated American intellectual life for half a century, seemed to go into almost total eclipse. And a movement of thought that had grown out of the experience of the Civil War seemed to reach its end with the beginning of the Cold War. When I was in school, we read Freud and Marx, we read Derrida and Foucault, we read Dworkin and Rawls, but we did not read James and Dewey, and we hardly heard the names of James and Dewey. So how did this happen? Now, James, Dewey, and Holmes were all modernists. That is, the eventual obsolescence of their thought would not have shocked them. Holmes liked to say there was no point in reading anything that had been written more than 20 years before, which wasn't really true of his habits as a reader, but it was his way of saying ideas run out of steam. And, of course, Holmes, James, and Dewey had helped to run a style of thought into the ground themselves, the style represented by the antebellum North, by the idea that the universe is an idea. But the reputation of pragmatism during the Cold War was not just the reputation of a style of thought that had come to seem antique, it was also the reputation of a style of thought that had come to seem a little dangerous. There are plenty of appeals to pragmatism in a non-philosophical sense of being realistic or consensual or non-ideological in the Cold War period, and we're all familiar with that strain of Cold War thought, but the pragmatic critique of truth and objectivity, those things that was avoided. The association of anti-foundationalism with tyranny is in fact a feature of many of the theoretical treatises on totalitarianism that the Cold War produced. Somehow relativism and anti-foundationalism were associated with revolutionary Marxism, which is, of course, is about as absolutist and chiliastic a philosophy as the 20th century has known. But what the pragmatists thought, of course, was that our most cherished beliefs, even our most cherished beliefs, are in the end just bets on the future. The pragmatists wished to bring principles and beliefs down to human level because they wished to avoid the violence they saw hidden in abstractions. That was one of the lessons that the Civil War had taught them. The political system their philosophy was designed to support was democracy. And democracy, as they understood it, isn't about just letting the right people have their say, it's also about letting the wrong people have the say. It's about giving space to minority and dissenting views so at the end of the day, the majority may prevail. Democracy means that everyone is in the game, but that no one can opt out of the game. Now, the Cold War was a war over principles. So a style of thought like pragmatism that elevated compromise over confrontation did not hold much appeal. Even the opponents of the Cold War, with a few exceptions like Sartre, even the opponents of the Cold War mounted their opposition on principle. People didn't protest the draft because they put patriotism in the dustbin with all the other outmoded notions of transcendent principles. They protested the draft because they believed in the existence of principles that transcended patriotism. The notion that the values of the free society for which the Cold War was waged were contingent, relative, fallible constructions, good for some purposes, maybe not so good for others, was not a notion compatible with the imperatives of the age. The great movement to secure civil liberties in the Cold War period in the United States arose out of a religious community, Black Southern Baptists, was founded on the belief that every individual has an inalienable right to those freedoms by virtue of being human, which is exactly the kind of philosophical foundationalism that the pragmatists were at pains to discredit. People like Holmes and Dewey thought rights were socially constructed. Martin Luther King Jr. did not. King was not a student of Dewey. He was a student of one of Dewey's great enemies, Reinhold Niebuhr. King was not a pragmatist, a relativist, or a pluralist. Those were doctrines he preached continually against. In 1954, on the eve of the Montgomery bus boycott, King gave the speech in the Holt Street Baptist Church that launched his career as a civil rights leader, and he spoke to the people who would begin the boycott the next day. And he said, quote, "If we are wrong, then God Almighty is wrong." That's not a pragmatist way of putting it. But it was the right way to put it for the battle that King hoped to win. But once the Cold War ended, the work of Holmes, James, Dewey, and even Peirce reemerged as suddenly as it had been eclipsed. Those writers began to be studied and debated with a seriousness and an intensity, both in the United States and in European countries, that they had not attracted for 40 years. So why did pragmatism reemerge in the 1990s? It may be because in the post-Cold War world, where there are many competing belief systems, not just two, skepticism about the finality of any particular set of beliefs began to seem an important value again. And so did the political theory. This skepticism helps to underwrite the theory that democracy is the value that validates all other values. Democratic participation isn't the means to an end in this way of thinking. It is the end. The purpose of the experiment is to keep the experiment going. There might be more institutional reasons for the reemergence of pragmatism in the 1990s, particularly in the university. One of the effects the Cold War had on the American university in the early years was it led to the dominance of a scientific model of inquiry. There was an emphasis on disinterestedness and objectivity that reflected a general post-ideological temper of the Cold War period, the temper epitomized in Daniel Bell's famous phrase used by him and others, the end of ideology, which sounds very pragmatist. The scientific spirit was also possibly a response to large amounts of money that came in from the federal government after the war, especially after the passage of the National Defense Education Act in 1954. Scholars eschewed political commitments because they wished not to offend their granting agencies. The idea that academics, particularly in the social sciences, could provide the state with neutral research results on which public policies could be based was an animating idea in the early Cold War university, and it spilled over into lots of fields that had nothing to do with public policy, like the fields in the humanities. This overemphasis on science produced a backlash, in part because the war in Vietnam shattered the post-war consensus, but also because the seeds of negation were already present in those Cold War disciplinary formations themselves. Thomas Kuhn, Hayden White, Clifford Geertz, Richard Rorty, Paul Demond, Stanley Fish. These are the people associated with the demise of scientific or disciplinary models of inquiry. They poked holes in the hull of disinterestedness. But the interesting part of their critique is that the work they produced was entirely within the disciplinary frameworks in which they had been trained. They pushed the disciplinary envelope so hard it ripped, and a lot of the contents fell out. Demond's work, for example, was just an extension of the kind of close rhetorical analysis that originated with the founders of English studies, people like William Empson and I.A. Richards. Richard Rorty's Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, which was published in 1979, was Rorty's attempt to put an end to or to transcend the analytic tradition of philosophy, but it constructed its arguments entirely from within the tradition of analytic philosophy. Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn's revisionist interpretation of the history of science, also a book that had a big influence on Rorty, is a perfectly conventional work in the philosophy of science. Kuhn's book may have inspired the rise of science studies, but Kuhn himself was emphatically not a practitioner of science studies. Pragmatism came back into the academy partly because its scientific replacements in various fields like analytic philosophy or structuralism had started to show their limitations. An intellectual formation constructed in the first part of the Cold War that venerated disinterestedness and rigor got flipped over during the Vietnam period and transformed into an intellectual formation that regarded disinterest and science with suspicion, and even worse. There's no question that Rorty's work appealed to this sentiment. Rorty, of course, is the person most responsible for the revival of pragmatism in the 1980s and 1990s. It's well known that Rorty's impact outside philosophy departments has been much greater than his impact in his own discipline. He's not actually taught in a philosophy department for more than 20 years. But it's not the case that Rorty thinks philosophy is obsolete or useless. Rorty thinks that there are problems, like what is truth, that people will always discuss philosophically. The scandal of Rorty's message is not that philosophy is finished, it's that people who are not philosophers don't need it. Which makes it a little ironic that the pragmatism he did so much to bring back into vogue is appropriated in the form of pragmatism and. I once listened to Rorty respond to remarks made by the architect Peter Eisenman at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Eisenman, who was once a deconstructionist architect, has taken to referring to himself as a pragmatist architect. And he explained in this forum with some passion how the philosophical premises of pragmatism had influenced his work. Rorty's response was, architects shouldn't read philosophy, they should just continue to make beautiful buildings. Many people find this degree of modesty unbecoming. I think Eisenman probably did. So my last question is whether pragmatism and the general way of thinking associated with it will continue to enjoy intention and interest, or whether that whole mode of inquiry will again become obsolete. One response that a number of people had to the attacks of September 11th was to say that they marked the end of irony, postmodernism, and relativism. A column in the New York Times that ran just 2 weeks after the attacks mentioned Rorty's name in a meditation on people whose views the attacks were imagined to have discredited. Those concepts in these columns, concepts of irony, postmodernism, and so forth, were generally defined in vague and journalistic terms. I should know, since I'm a journalist. But one knows what was meant. What was meant was that the world had suddenly become too serious for skepticism, for post-philosophical playfulness, for the view that where art is concerned, anything goes, and that where truth is concerned, it's all a matter of where you're coming from. It seemed as though vigilance required metaphysics. I think it's the case that the United States turned a page on September 11th. It seemed to do so with an unusual degree of self-consciousness. No one wanted the world we were living in to come into being, but it seems that people were very eager to see the end of the 1990s. Does that mean that relativism and skepticism are finished? That the attacks closed the book on the culture of the 90s, a culture in which neo-pragmatism played a big role, not as big a role as Seinfeld or the Starr Report, but big in its own sphere? It's way too soon to know. I mean, one thing to say is that the period of sobriety that followed September 11th seemed to include a desire to stop the kind of witch hunting that led columnists to use the attacks as a trump card in intellectual disagreements. There was a break in the culture wars post-September 11th. Solidarity was the mood of the day. We should also say, though, that we are now post-September 11th. 2 wars have intervened. However we might define the cultural moment at the end of 2001, we are in some ways in a different moment from at the beginning of 2004. Now we're at a moment when the attacks themselves are used as a trump card in political disagreements. Also, the sense of sobriety seems to have disappeared, possibly because moods like that are always temporary, possibly because it was seen to be exploited. It would certainly be difficult to say there's less irony and irreverence and skepticism in American culture than there was in 2000. It's very hard to get those things out of a commercial culture. What has been the role of the American intellectual in bringing this post-war September 11th moment into being? For better or worse, it has not been pragmatic. The most vigorous and coherent line taken by intellectual commentators before the invasion of Iraq was a pro-war line, and the pro-war position was assumed in the name of an idea. Liberal interventionists wanted to support war, but to distance themselves from the administration that would actually carry it out and dispose of the consequences. They accomplished this by endorsing the war in the name of an idea. They were liberal messianists. They excused the nature of the instruments at hand in the name of modernity, globalization, freedom. They had an idea about Americanness which they wished to export to the rest of the world, and they believed that they were on the right side of history. Of course, now there's some second guessing going on. We may not hear quite the same sort of exhortations in the future, but that's not the important point. The point is that a lot of people who should have known better seized a chance to apostatize an idea and to encourage others to mobilize in its cause. There was a turn in intellectual life because the world is a little crazy right now. People want something to hang on to. Pragmatism is not great at giving things to hang on to. It's much better at giving reasons to let go. This turn in intellectual life will take us down what path, I don't know. It may have come about because of September 11th. It may just have been another turn of the wheel. But I do suspect that pragmatism's third moment is probably over. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for questions. If you would raise your hand. Sir.
Excuse me.
Are there strong similarities between pragmatism and French post-structuralist thought, especially Derrida and Foucault?
Richard Rorty published The Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature in 1979. As I mentioned, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature is really an attempt to undermine the premises of modern philosophy, and particularly analytic philosophy, by using the arguments of analytic philosophy as the tools to take down the house, as it were. In that book, he rarely mentions pragmatism, Rorty. In fact, at the end of the book, when he turns to what philosophy might now become, he talks about hermeneutics, but he doesn't really talk very much about pragmatism. 3 years later, in 1982, he published a book called Consequences of Pragmatism, which is a collection of essays, and I think that's the book that had a big impact on people, because it was much less technical than Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. It made people go back and read Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. That's how I read Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature after I read the second book. And in that book, he had a number of essays in which he said that the thought of post-structuralists like Derrida is very similar to the thought of people like John Dewey. And this was a brilliant move because at the time those essays came out, a lot of people in humanities departments were breaking their heads trying to figure out what Derrida was talking about. And here some guy comes along and says, oh, you don't have to read that, you can read John Dewey, you know, and he writes in English. So it was a great move. It was and this often happens in American culture, actually. It was a way of dealing with the importation of a European way of thought, or sometimes it's in the case of an art form, into America by saying, yeah, this stuff is good, but actually we already did that stuff. And so what Rorty did was to assimilate post-structuralism to pragmatism. Was this the gentleman's question, basically, was this a valid move? Well, in pragmatist terms, it worked. It cashed out because it persuaded a lot of people who were not in philosophy departments and had less at stake. It persuaded a lot of people that what they'd been learning from Derrida and from to a certain extent from Foucault was a kind of anti-foundationalism fundamentally, which you can find in the writings of James and Dewey. And so it was a successful thing. Rorty has, I think, maintain an allegiance to Derrida in his thought. He still thinks that Derrida is a compatible soul intellectually. Rorty has always had difficulties with Foucault. He thinks of Foucault as the way he thinks of Nietzsche, as the darker side of anti-foundationalism, and he prefers to associate with the kind of irenic side that you find particularly in Dewey. So, you know, he's chosen among the French post-structuralists, but that is the move that was made, and it seems to have worked. In the back.
Me? Okay. Regarding the comparisons amongst Foucault, Rorty, and all that, what is your take on Rorty in that connection? For example, when you discussed modernity in terms of the end of reciprocity in social relations, were you quoting James or Dewey or Foucault? So I wonder what kind of a position does Foucault stand in your mind? That's the first question. Second question, I was a little curious why the notion God was never mentioned when you discussed the first and the second moment.
The first question is my assessment of Foucault, or where Foucault fits into. Yeah. First of all, I'm not a philosopher, so I'm a historian. So I'm just trying to describe what the ideas are, and this would be my description as far as that question is concerned. The original pragmatist generation, the generation of James and Dewey, it developed as I tried to explain it, a theory about thinking, which I think throughout the 20th century has, I'll put it another way. James and Dewey developed a theory about thinking which, in the light of subsequent 20th century thought, seems inadequate to account for the reasons why people reach decisions that they reach. And the reason it seems inadequate is because from Freud onward through Foucault, thinkers have uncovered and theorized a whole array of subconscious or extrapersonal forces that shape the way people make decisions. James and Dewey's thought, therefore, as I said, is rather irenic in the sense that in the best possible world, we choose a belief, we act as though it's true, and the universe meets us halfway. But of course, in the real world, the forces that determine what we choose and the effect that that choice will have on the universe is highly overdetermined by things that we have no control over. So Foucault contributes to that critique of the pragmatist version of anti-foundationalism by pointing out that relations of power, often invisible to us, operate powerfully to affect our choices in life. So that's where I would place him in that. I would place him as philosophically similar to the pragmatists in terms of just his epistemology, but quite different from them in terms of where his emphasis lies. Second question the gentleman asked had to do with my failure to mention God. It's a good question because in the case of William James in particular, the reason that he developed pragmatism was precisely to defend the right to believe in God. The book that he published just before he gave the pragmatism lecture of 1898 is called The Will to Believe, and it's a defense of the right of people to have a religious faith. Why did he feel it important to make that argument? Because he felt that 19th century science had held that you can't believe in something that you cannot empirically prove. And since God, by definition, is metaphysical, cannot be proved or measured but scientifically, the only respectable position is agnosticism. So James wrote many of his essays, and really his book Pragmatism, as an effort to dislodge that way of thinking by saying that you can believe in God and that belief can be true if it works for you. If it makes a difference for you in the universe to believe in God, then it can be made true. It doesn't have to wait on empirical confirmation. So religious belief is very important for James. I think it's less important for Dewey. It's not important at all for Holmes. But it is certainly part of the first era of pragmatic thought. You had a question back. Yeah.
Okay, this is probably too essentialist, but I want to ask whether you think it's really legitimate for Rorty to call himself a pragmatist. Because in particular, the first wave folks had a view that allowed for a notion of meliorism or improvement even though there wasn't an independent end. Rorty doesn't think there can be any such thing. Rorty thinks we just keep rolling along and we hope that we prevail against the forces of evil. So the question is whether he really is a nihilist and not a pragmatist.
I can't accept that characterization of Rorty's thought. I think Rorty is he's very much a man of the left. I think that he's a man who strongly believes in social reform and political reform. I don't think that he thinks that his anti-foundationalism has any relevance to his political views or his political activism. So I wouldn't characterize him as a nihilist.
Maybe he's not a nihilist, but there is this quote where he says, if the secret police come tomorrow and kill us all, we have nothing to say against them because we allowed it to happen, and that is just our world. So he has no position from which to say it's wrong, even though he is actually quite a mensch when it comes to actually doing political stuff.
Yeah, well, I don't know that quote, so I can't comment exactly on it. But, yeah, let me put it this way. A degree of fatalism creeps into a pragmatist approach at some point. There's no question about it. I think if that's the point you're making, I agree with it. Is Rorty himself a fatalist? Not in my experience. I don't think that he is. He has a manner which seems to shrug off issues having to do with, do we need foundations? That's the response of the architect. Just make beautiful buildings. Don't worry about the metaphysics of it. But and that does seem to people to have a kind of quiescence. But for what it's worth, I don't think that he himself could be counted as a person who's quiescent or who doesn't want to be active. But I take your point, sir.
Excuse me, would you like to have this?
I was just asking if you could briefly explain how Posner fits into the third movement. Is it sort of rejecting natural law for efficiency, or just wondering if you could explain that?
Yeah, Posner comes at it in a funny way because Posner is basically a conservative. Judge Posner is a judge in the federal court in Chicago and who writes a book about every 10 minutes, published by Harvard University Press, and they're amazing books. So they're not facile books. And he seems to know just about everything. And he has come to pragmatism in a funny way because he began, as you probably know, if you know his work at all, he began as one of the founders of the school called Law and Economics. And the basic thrust of that was that judicial decisions ought to reflect economic cost-benefit analysis. And that really that's the purpose, is to shift the burden in a way, in cases, to shift the burden in a way that will be ultimately the most economically efficient for society as a whole. And that's basically a conservative Chicago school line of thought. At some point, and I don't know the history of it specifically, at some point Posner hooked up with Holmes, and he became a big champion of Oliver Wendell Holmes, who also was not a liberal, in fact. But he liked Holmes's anti-foundationalism. What he liked about Holmes was that Holmes had the view that the law is not based on abstract principles. Was his famous phrase in one of Holmes's opinions. The common law, what is it? A common law is not a brooding omnipresence in the sky, or something like that. The law doesn't come from somewhere outside of us. The law is what judges make, and it's only what judges make. And they will find the principles to support their decisions after they've basically reached the decision. When I describe thinking as a process of getting to a point you knew you were going to get to before you started, it's a very Holmesian way of describing it. Posner then published a collection of Holmes's writings called The Essential Holmes, which is an excellent anthology, by the way. And he has written several essays on Holmes and on legal pragmatism. But it's a funny alliance because the law and economics movement, on the face of it, doesn't seem to have a whole lot to do with other areas where you see neo-pragmatism flourishing. So it seems like, in Posner's case, pragmatism seems like a philosophical way of explaining why you don't have to worry about legal principles in the traditional abstract way, and that you could make decisions based on a kind of a cost-benefit analysis. Most notoriously, Posner analyzed the case of Bush v. Gore in a book published shortly after the decision in his usual rapid way, in which he defended the decision in Bush v. Gore as the most expedient decision. Now, that seemed to me completely illogical, because the decision in Bush v. Gore, as you'll remember, was not made on grounds that, well, this will just end things faster. It was made on grounds that the 14th Amendment, than which there is no bigger monolithic principle in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment meant that any effort to continue the count would be not afford citizens of Florida all equal protection. When you bring the 14th Amendment out, you're bringing a principle out. That's a terrible swift sword. That is not just that is not a meliorist or pragmatic way of deciding a case. But that was Posner's argument in that book. we have one more question? Yes, ma'am.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the intellectual historical story, looking backwards toward the beginning of the 19th century, and address the extent to which the pragmatists are coming out of common sense philosophy and are, to some extent, maybe exaggerating the extent of their departure from their the philosophies of the sort of antebellum period, because it seems to me that there's as much affinity between the common sense school and what the pragmatists come up with as there is a sort of dissimilarity between what the pragmatists like Dewey and James say and what some of the more recent expositors of pragmatism are claiming pragmatism stands for.
Yeah, that's a completely fair question, and there's no doubt that pragmatism has continuities with earlier traditions in American thought, and as you say, the continuities are, the differences are sort of equivalent to the differences between James and Dewey and people like Posner and Rorty. So I think in that sense, it's quite fair to say that looking back over American history, there is a pragmatic or proto-pragmatic strain of thought that's easy to hook up the pragmatists to. Sometimes people do hook up the pragmatists to writers like Benjamin Franklin. More often it's with Emerson. The only thing I would say about that is that I don't think one should underestimate the influence that the theory of natural selection had on pragmatism as a philosophy. I really do think that that's basically gave them the impetus to develop pragmatism. And the reason was, and Dewey is fairly explicit about this, the reason was that they felt philosophy had fallen behind science, because science was changing the world, and Darwin had described a world that didn't fit traditional philosophy, described a world of constant flux and change in which topics like epistemology just didn't mean anything, because the minds didn't stay the same and the world didn't stay the same long enough to talk about reflecting things accurately or correspondence theories of truth and so forth. So what they were trying to do, I think, really was explicitly, certainly in 1872, was to say, well, this is what Darwin has said. How can we adapt to philosophy to this way of imagining the universe? And that, that is specific to that moment. Listen, thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Luke, and I hope those of you who have not read the Metaphysical Club will now read it. It is really an elegant book. Thank you for coming.